Hey Squishies! Welcome back to another vlog. This is Dirty Pair, episode 15. Dig here, meow meow, happiness is at the end. Which is a strange title, and I still don't know where the meow meow came from. That said, this was a really fun episode. This was a really good episode. It was the best episode they've had in a while, and I was really happy with it. It also is coming up at a really good time because it ties in really well with stuff I've been talking about in my Ducktales reviews, which I've been doing more or less as episodes come out. So the fact that this, vlog about a show from 25 years ago is, 35 years ago, is tying in well with a vlog about a show that just aired. It's a nice coincidence. So I think that's where I'm going to start with, is kind of getting into some of the roots of this episode, because very obviously this is an Indiana Jones pastiche. Indiana Jones even briefly shows up in it as a skeleton, killed by one of the traps in the ruins. Don't remember the civilization's name that built them, I just remember the planet was named Yucca. And generally, there's a whole Mesoamerican flavor to it, which kind of ties into Yucca, which is a Central or South American, or both, plant. It's a starchy root, similar to a potato, but so much better. Oh, Yucca fries are the best. Anyway, the thing is, Indiana Jones is not a particularly original work. It's extremely well executed, and Harrison Ford is utterly charming in it, but it really is just a rehash of things that were done before. And normally what people point to is the adventure serials of the 40s, which, yes, absolutely, definitely, that is a huge part. But there's another influence there too, and one that has been pretty well established, I think even admitted to, by Spielberg and or Lucas, which is interesting because it's also a major influence on anime. And the series that I've been talking about similar topics in other vlogs, namely Ducktales. Because the common thing that all these things draw from are the comics of Karl Marx. Now, I've talked about him before in some of my other videos, but I don't think I've talked about him in Dirty Pair, so very briefly. Karl Marx was a comic artist who worked for Disney. He redesigned Donald Ducks. If you've seen, old Disney cartoons, you notice how Donald Duck looks very, very different from how he looks in modern depictions. Karl Marx, in the late 30s, early 40s, I think, created his modern look, also created the entire extended Duck group of characters. He created Huey, Dewey, and Louie. I believe he created Daisy. He definitely created Scrooge. Gladstone Gander, Ludwig von Drake, all the other ducks, the Disney ducks, were basically his creations, with very few exceptions. And those are all, the few exceptions are ones that were created after he retired, basically. He was very influential. When people talk about how Osamu Tezuka was influenced by Disney, they really mean Bambi and the comics of Karl Marx. Tezuka was pretty clear about this himself. He actually sent fan mail to Karl Marx. He would send letters to him on his birthday. He was a huge fan, and those were really in terms of Western art influences, those were his two biggest influences. He was also heavily influenced by the Japanese Kamishibai paper theater and by other forms of Japanese art, but he also brought into it some Western influences, and primarily the biggest ones were Bambi and the comics of Karl Marx. And of course, Tezuka is known today as the god of manga. He is a huge influence on manga and therefore on anime. You know, he created Astro Boy, which is not actually the first anime, but it's kind of the most influential and important of the very early anime. And much of that can be traced back to Karl Marx. Meanwhile, Marx himself was very influenced by the adventure serials of the 40s, especially in his comics about Scrooge and about the adventures of Scrooge and Donald. In turn, those were actually very influential in the Indiana Jones movies. Quite a few of the set pieces in Indiana Jones are actually taken from Karl Marx, Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck comics. Most famously, the sequence of the rolling spherical boulder that Indiana Jones is running away from in, I think that was Raiders of the Lost Ark. That is lifted directly from one of Karl Marx's comics. Which, I mean, is what you do when you're making a pastiche. The thing about Indiana Jones, though, is that it doesn't really comment on the things it's pastiching. It's just taking them, putting them together into a movie, handing you that movie and saying, isn't this cool? Which is, you know, fine as far as it goes, but it means a lot of stuff that was an issue in those older works is kind of just replicated in stuff like Indiana Jones. And when it came out in '87, the first Ducktales had the same problem. And while it's doing better than the first Ducktales, the new Ducktales is having some of the same problem. And the biggest of those problems is that these kinds of adventure archaeology things are imperialist as hell. You remember the famous sequence, the famous line, that belongs in a museum, you know, where Indiana Jones has been delving into this ancient temple. He makes it past all these traps, gets the idol or whatever it was, comes back out, and it's, you know, chase sequence involving the unnamed natives, and then the rival or whatever takes it from him and takes the idol from him, and Jones says, you know, that you know, how dare you take that to sell it for profit? That belongs in a museum. No, it bloody well doesn't, Mr. Jones. I don't know why I turned slightly British there for a second. It does not belong in a museum. Why? Because those traps were very obviously well maintained. The natives are right there. This is their place, their temple, their idol. Putting it in a museum is just as much stealing it as, you know, selling it for profit. It belongs in the temple. You can't just go around stealing stuff from other cultures. You know, now if the culture is truly extinct and has no inheritors whatsoever, okay, then maybe you can take it and put it in a museum. But like, for example, Egypt has history stretching back thousands of years. It's been conquered, it's been, you know, through all sorts of changes, but it is still a place where you can trace back the history thousands of years back to the people who built the pyramids and the tombs and so on. And in the 19th century, people just raided those for treasure, and museums in Europe and to a lesser extent North America are filled with stuff taken from them. And it's a real issue. The Egyptian government wants them back because it's theirs. You know, those things do, you know, the Egyptian people still exist. They may have a somewhat different ethnic makeup now than they did 6,000 years ago, but who doesn't? You know, they're still the Egyptian people. They're the inheritors of that land and that culture, and it belongs to them. And it's unconscionable that it was looted and isn't being given back. But that's imperialism for you. That's what it does. It comes up with excuses to rob other cultures. You know, it's well, we're going to study it instead of just leaving it there. Well, it's their property. If they want to study it, they can study it. If they don't, too bad. You can encourage them to let you help them study it, but it's their property. You can't just take it because you think you will be a better owner. You know? And so that's a problem with the whole genre. You know, a lot of the genre is rooted in that 19th century kind of archaeology that was basically just grave robbing. And even as it gets updated into more modern-ish attitudes where, you know, the goal is not to get rich but to study, even then it's very imperialist. And so Dirty Pair takes that, they decide they'll do a pastiche of it, but they're going to do better than Indiana Jones did. They're not just going to take all this stuff and jam it together and leave in these problems. They're actually going to change it. They're going to find a solution. And that's great, because I've been talking about how the adventure episodes of the old Ducktales were a lot of fun, but had these serious racism problems. And oh boy, could the old Ducktales be straight up racist. And the new Ducktales has mostly avoided having those kinds of episodes, but it has had a couple of them, and with the exception of the pilot, they've had racism problems. Now, Dirty Pair comes along and says, no, this is how you do it without racism, and lo and behold, it's just like the DuckTales pilot, only better. So they go into the... So the first thing that's established is that the civilization that created this is more advanced. They were, you know, throughout the whole episode, they keep saying again and again how advanced the technology was, how advanced the people who built this place were. Like, it's a running gag, but at the same time, it's hammering in a point, which is that this is not a quote-unquote primitive indigenous culture, which historically has meant our weapons are better than theirs, and therefore we get to conquer them and call them primitive. It's a culture which is more advanced. It's like, imagine if, you know, European sailors or, you know, because Japan got into the imperialism game in the first half of the 20th century. They got into it hardcore. But imagine if one of these imperialist nations, you know, Japan or Europe or whatever, had sailed off in their exploring vessels and found a hyper-advanced culture that had stuff to teach them that they wanted to learn. Because obviously, cultures always have stuff to teach other cultures, but people don't always want to learn it. They don't always see a value in it. But imagine this culture had, you know, stuff that the imperialist cultures recognized as wealth and power and desirable things. You know, that's a very different scenario. It's a common science fiction scenario, but it's being combined here with a genre that is usually not very science fiction-y. So there's that. Second, there's the fact that the planet is uninhabited now. There are no inheritors. There is no one that this belongs to anymore, and it is therefore okay to go in and take from it. And then third, the big reveal at the end that there's no treasure there. You know, and they do the thing with, oh, it was the teamwork all along. And while that is something of a cliche, though honestly, I don't think I've ever seen it in anything except anime and JRPGs. In fact, off the top of my head, the only other time I can think of teamwork is the real treasure being a thing was Skies of Arcadia, which is a great game, especially the GameCube remake. That was just A+. And also a really great game to give you a feel like you're exploring. It captured that very well. So initially they do that, but even if that is a cliche, it's still got a point to it. It's still saying, the real treasure of these kinds of ancient ruins and archaeology and so forth is not the wealth to be acquired from it, but the knowledge. It's learning things about humanity, and therefore about ourselves and other cultures and all that great stuff. And then it takes it to the next step by revealing that no, actually the guy lied, and it's actually he's got now the hyper-advanced technology and able to create this new energy source, which is very funny, and the cap to a running gag that's been running through the whole episode of him setting up for an adventure story cliche and then saying, no, actually, I was just kidding. This is really what's going on. For example, Clementine, when he first introduces her and says that, she's an ex-lover. And I says, no, not really. She was just my assistant. It's a running gag with Garlic Joe. Note, by the way, that Joe is very old but spry man with a great knowledge of these ancient ruins. There's a little bit of Scrooge McDuck in him. Although, in another sense, he's basically Indiana Jones 40 years later. Because the Indiana Jones movies are, of course, set in the 40s. So by the 80s, he would be getting up in years. So, is there anything else I wanted to say about this? Another thing I like is the way it builds up to kind of the punchline at the end. Because first, you have the, Kay and Yuri flirting with that guy and him saying that he's going to fill their apartment with roses. And it's honestly pretty cute, but also they're bored. And as soon as an opportunity for adventure shows up, they'd much rather do that than flirt with a cute guy. They then get into the whole sequence of gags with, here's a cliche, wait, no, not really, playing with that with Garlic Joe. Culminating in them pulling the, oh, he scammed us, except not really. Yes, he kind of scammed them out of their millions of credits, but he also gave them the thing they were saying was kind of nice right before he showed up. And more importantly, that's not really what it was about, Kay and Yuri, for all that they are often outwardly motivated by wealth and sex, are actually pretty decent people. And they helped an old man achieve his life goal. And now he's rich and they're not. But, honestly, they have a pretty comfortable life. So they don't mind that much. And I actually really like that because that helps kind of reaffirm that Kay and Yuri are slightly more complex characters than they've been acting like the last few episodes. That there is this degree of performativity to what they do when they are going after boys or being, wanting money. Yes, these are things they want, but there's a degree of performance in how much they pursue them. There are things that matter to them. There is some depth to them underneath that. They just put on this facade, which again gets back into the series' wrestling roots. Because, Kay and Yuri are based on a professional wrestling duo in, a real-life Japanese professional wrestling duo, who were, I believe, called the Lovely Angels. And, you know, it's the whole kayfabe thing. They're playing a role very knowingly. But I feel like the last few episodes, part of what has kind of made the show a little shaky the last few episodes, I feel like, is that it is partially forgotten that Kay and Yuri are just playing a role, and this is it reasserting that they are. So yeah, great episode. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, as always, to Bennett Jackson, who commissioned the Dirty Pair series for me. I'm really, you know, I've never stopped loving the series, and this episode has reaffirmed after a few ones why I love it so much. This is just great. So, hope you all enjoyed that. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you'd like to see videos in advance or commission your own, you can click the Patreon link. And I'll see y'all later. Bye.